October 15th, 1852. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight across the hills of western Pennsylvania, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that grabbed at the wagon wheels like desperate hands. Inside the covered carriage, 13 children pressed close together on the hard wooden benches, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The youngest was a girl named Mary, barely 4 years old, who clutched a torn cloth doll against her chest. Her dark eyes were too big for her pale face, and she had not spoken a word since the fever took her mother 6 weeks before. Next to her sat Thomas, age 7, who kept one protective arm around Mary's shoulders while he stared out through a crack in the canvas covering. His other hand held tight to a small wooden horse, the only thing left from his father's carpentry shop before the fire. The older children sat in silence. There was Sarah, 12 years old, who had been caring for her younger siblings until the consumption took them one by one, leaving only her. There was James, 10, whose parents had died in a mill accident, and who still had burns on his hand from trying to pull his father from the machinery. Each child carried their own story of loss, their own weight of sorrow that settled over the carriage like another blanket. Sister Margaret sat at the front of the carriage, her young face turned toward the road ahead. She was only 23, barely more than a child herself, but she wore the heavy black robes of her order with the careful dignity of someone trying to be stronger than she felt. Her rosary beads clicked softly in her hands as she prayed, though she was not sure anymore what she was praying for. The letter from the diocese had been clear. 13 orphans from the overcrowded St. Mary's home in Pittsburgh were to be transported to Bellmoor House, a private orphanage in the hills near a small town called Millfield. The letter spoke of clean air, good food, and kind caretakers who would give these children the home they deserved. Sister Margaret had felt hope when she read those words. Hope was a dangerous thing for someone who worked with orphans, but she had allowed herself to feel it anyway. The coachman, a weathered man named Henry Walsh, had grown quieter as they traveled deeper into the hills. He had made this journey many times before, carrying supplies to the scattered farms and small towns that dotted the countryside. But today, something felt different. The birds had gone silent. Even the usual forest sound seemed muffled by more than just the rain. "Sister," Henry called back over his shoulder, his voice rough from years of tobacco and cold weather. "We're getting close now. Should see the gates soon." Sister Margaret felt her heart quicken. She looked back at the children, their faces pale and tired from the long journey. Some slept against each other's shoulders. Others stared out at the passing trees with the blank expression of those who had learned not to hope for too much. "Children," she said softly, "we're almost there. Almost to your new home." Mary looked up at her with those dark, searching eyes. The little girl had not spoken since Pittsburgh, but her eyes seemed to ask questions that Sister Margaret could not answer. What if this place is like the others? What if they don't want us? What if there is no safe place anywhere in the world? The carriage lurched as it hit a deep rut in the road, and everyone shifted and grabbed for something to hold on to. Through the sound of the rain and the creaking wheels, they could hear Henry talking to his horses, encouraging them up what must be a steep hill. Then, suddenly, the carriage stopped. Sister Margaret looked out through the front opening and saw iron gates, tall and black, stretching up into the gray sky. Beyond them, through the falling rain, stood a house. But something was wrong. The house was dark. Every window was covered with boards. The yard was overgrown with weeds that had been left to die and rot in the autumn cold. Henry climbed down from his seat, his boots splashing in the mud. Sister Margaret watched him walk to the gates, which hung open on their hinges like broken arms. He stood there for a long moment, reading something. Then his shoulders sagged, and he took off his hat, letting the rain soak his gray hair. "Sister," he called, his voice different now, smaller. "Sister, you need to see this." Sister Margaret climbed down from the carriage, her long robes immediately heavy with rain and mud. She walked to where Henry stood and saw what had drained the color from his face. Nailed to the gate was a notice, written in formal script but already faded by weather and time. She read it once, then again, the words not making sense in her mind. "By order of the County Court of Millfield, Pennsylvania. Bellmoor House for orphaned children is hereby declared permanently closed as of July 20th, 1852. The property is sealed, pending investigation into circumstances beyond repair. No entry permitted by law or by Christian conscience. July 20th. 3 months ago. Sister Margaret stared at the notice until the words blurred in the rain. 3 months ago, when the letter from the diocese was already written. 3 months ago, when plans were already being made to send 13 children to this place. Behind her, she could hear the children stirring in the carriage. Thomas was asking if they were there yet. One of the younger boys was crying softly. Mary's doll had fallen to the floor, and someone was trying to reach it for her. Henry stood beside her, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Sister," he said quietly, "what do we do now?" She looked at the dark house beyond the gates, at the boarded windows that looked like closed eyes, at the weeds growing up through what had once been a garden path. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last of the autumn leaves, preparing the world for winter. From the carriage came the sound of children's voices, small and tired and trusting. They were asking when they could get out. They were asking if they were home. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of 13 lives pressing down on her shoulders like stones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing, though she could not see any church through the gray afternoon light. The truth came to Sister Margaret like cold water in the face, sudden and sharp and impossible to ignore. She stood in the rain outside Bellmoor House, holding the letter from Father Morrison that Henry had pulled from his coat pocket with shaking hands. The ink had run in places, but the words were still clear enough to break her heart. "Sister Margaret," the letter read, "by the time you receive this, you will understand that sometimes the Church must make difficult choices. The Bellmoor situation became known to us after your departure. We trust in your faith to find God's purpose in this trial. The children are in his hands now, as are you." October 16th, 1852. 24 hours since they had arrived at the empty house. 24 hours since she had realized that the men who sent them here had known. They had known the house was closed. They had known there would be no caretakers, no warm beds, no hot meals waiting. They had sent 13 orphaned children into the wilderness like lambs to wolves, and they had sent her to watch it happen. Henry had refused to leave them. The old coachman had unhitched his horses and led them to the small stable behind the house, muttering prayers and curses in equal measure. 40 years I've been taking people where they need to go, he told Sister Margaret as they forced open the front door of Bellmoor House. Never left nobody in the cold yet. Not starting now. The house welcomed them with silence and dust and the smell of things left too long alone. The children filed in quietly, their small voices echoing in the empty rooms. The floors were bare wood, scarred and stained. The walls showed pale rectangles where pictures had once hung. In the main hall, a grandfather clock stood frozen at 20 minutes past 3, as if time itself had given up on this place. Sister Margaret walked through the rooms with growing dread. The kitchen had no food in the cabinets, no wood for the stove. The bedrooms held nothing but bare mattresses, some torn and stained with things she did not want to imagine. In what had been the dining hall, long tables sat empty under a thin layer of dust, set for meals that would never come. The children followed her like ghosts, their footsteps soft on the wooden floors. They did not complain. They had learned not to complain, but their eyes held questions that cut deeper than any words could have. Thomas still carried his wooden horse, holding it tight against his chest as he peered into empty rooms. Sarah, the oldest at 12, had taken charge of the smaller children without being asked, helping them find corners to sit in, sharing the few pieces of bread Henry had brought from town. Little Mary clutched her torn doll and watched everything with those dark, knowing eyes. That first night, they huddled together in the main hall, sharing Henry's blankets and what little food remained in his travel pack. Sister Margaret lit a fire in the great fireplace using broken furniture, and the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. The children pressed close to the warmth, and for a moment, it almost felt like safety. But when morning came, the fire had died to cold ashes, and reality returned like a knife to the heart. Henry counted their supplies with the careful attention of a man who had seen hunger before. 2 days of food, maybe 3 if we're careful, he said quietly to Sister Margaret while the children still slept. No milk for the little ones. No medicine if someone gets sick. And winter's coming fast. Through the boarded windows, they could see the gray sky growing heavier with clouds. The air carried the sharp bite that promised snow before the week was out. In the hills of Pennsylvania, winter came early and stayed late, and it showed no mercy to the unprepared. Sister Margaret knelt in the empty chapel she had found on the second floor, her knees pressing into the hard wooden planks where an altar had once stood. She prayed for guidance, for strength, for some miracle that would save 13 innocent lives. But the silence that answered her felt as empty as the house around them. On the third day, as she searched through the basement for anything useful, she found the records. Boxes of papers, thrown together and left behind when the house was closed. Most were water-damaged and unreadable, but some pages had survived. She read them by candlelight, her hands trembling as the story unfolded. Bellmoor House had closed because children had died, not from sickness or accident, but from neglect so profound it was almost murder. The caretakers had sold the food meant for the orphans. They had burned the children's clothes for fuel. They had locked the sick ones in the basement to die alone rather than pay for medicine. The final report, dated July 18th, 1852, spoke of 12 small graves found in the woods behind the house. 12 children buried in unmarked plots, their names lost to time and shame. The investigators had used words like criminal negligence and crimes against God and nature. Sister Margaret sat in that basement, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal and death, and understood with terrible clarity why the diocese had sent them here. Not by accident, not through ignorance, but because 13 more orphans were easier to lose than to care for. Because the church's books would balance better without their mouths to feed, their bodies to clothe, their souls to tend. She climbed the stairs with legs that felt like lead, each step carrying the weight of this new knowledge. In the main hall, she found the children sharing the last of the bread, breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces so everyone could have some. Mary sat in Thomas's lap, her doll pressed against her cheek. Sarah was singing a lullaby to the youngest boys, her voice soft and brave in the gathering darkness. They looked up at her with trust still shining in their faces. They believed she would find a way to save them. They believed that someone, somewhere, cared about their small lives. The first snowflakes began to fall as evening came, drifting past the cracks in the boarded windows like tears from a grieving sky. Sister Margaret watched them gather on the windowsills and knew that time was running out. Henry found her standing there, looking out at the white world beyond. "Sister," he said quietly, "I've been thinking. There's a town about 20 miles south. Millfield proper. Maybe we could take the children there, find someone who'd take them in." She turned to look at him, this rough old man who had stayed when he could have left, who had chosen to share their fate when wisdom said to run. 20 miles through snow, Henry, with children this young, some of them already weak from hunger. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was not saying. Not all of them would survive such a journey. Maybe none of them would. "Then what do we do?" he asked. Sister Margaret looked back at the children, huddled around the dying fire like sparrows in a storm. 13 lives. 13 souls entrusted to her care by men who had already written them off as lost. She thought of the graves in the woods behind the house, of the children who had died here before, forgotten and alone. But these children were not alone. They had her. They had Henry. They had each other. And sometimes, she realized, when all the promises of the world fail you, you have to make promises of your own, even if they might break your heart to keep them. November 3rd, 1852. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival at Bellmoor House, and the children had begun to find things in the dark corners where shadows gathered like old secrets. It started with Thomas, who was always wandering, always looking for something his 7-year-old mind could not name. Behind a loose board in the dining hall, he found a small wooden horse, painted red but faded now to the color of dried roses. "Look, sister," he whispered, holding up his discovery next to his own carved horse. They match. Sister Margaret took the toy in her hands, feeling the smooth wood worn soft by small fingers. On the bottom, carved in careful letters, was a name, Peter, aged 6 to 1851. The year before, one of the children who had lived here before the house went dark. The finding became a quiet game among them, a way to fill the long hours when hunger made them too weak to play and too restless to sleep. Sarah discovered a tin box hidden under the floorboards of what had been the girls' dormitory. Inside were photographs, their edges torn and water-stained, showing children's faces that looked back at them like ghosts made of silver and light. "This one looks like Mary," Sarah said softly, holding up a picture of a small girl with dark eyes and pale skin. "See? Same chin, same way of holding her head." Little Mary pressed close to look, her torn doll clutched against her chest. She had still not spoken, but her eyes grew wide as she stared at the photograph of a child who might have been her sister or herself in another life. In the boys' room upstairs, James found words carved into the wooden wall beside one of the beds. The letters were small and cramped, scratched deep with what must have been a nail or a piece of sharp stone. "Cold all the time," the message read. "They forgot about us down here. God forgot too." Below that, in different handwriting, Mama said she would come back. Christmas. She promised Christmas. And below that, smaller and harder to read, no Christmas came. Henry had shown the older children how to search the house safely, warning them about loose boards and broken glass. They moved through the empty rooms like gentle spirits, touching nothing without need, disturbing nothing without purpose. But the house seemed to want to tell its stories. Each day brought new discoveries, new voices from the past speaking through the things they had left behind. In the chapel, Sarah found a child's prayer book with pages missing, but still readable in the candlelight that had become their only source of warmth and light. The margins were filled with small drawings, stick figures holding hands, houses with smoke coming from their chimneys, birds flying towards something that might have been the sun. The cold was getting worse. Each morning brought frost on the inside of the boarded windows, and their breath made clouds that lingered in the still air. Sister Margaret had burned almost all the broken furniture she could find, but would burn fast, and the house was large and full of empty spaces that swallowed heat like hungry mouths. The children had grown thinner. Their faces were pale as winter sky, their eyes too large in their small heads. They moved slower now, saving their strength for the important things, staying warm, staying together, staying alive one more day. It was Mary who found the door. She had been following a draft of cold air that whispered through the kitchen like a voice calling her name. Behind the big cooking stove, almost hidden in shadow, was a narrow door that the adults had missed. Mary pushed it open with her small hands and peered into the darkness beyond. The stairs went down into the earth, carved from stone and slick with moisture. The air that rose from below was different from the rest of the house, warmer, and it carried scents that made Mary's empty stomach clench with hope. Apples, potatoes, the earthy smell of a root cellar. She called to the others in the only way she knew how, tugging on Thomas's sleeve and pointing down the stairs with urgent gestures. Soon all 13 children were gathered around the hidden door, their eyes bright with the first hope they had felt in weeks. Henry went down first, carrying a candle and testing each step with careful feet. Sister Margaret followed, her heart beating fast with prayer and fear in equal measure. The children waited above, holding hands in a circle around the opening, listening to the footsteps fade into darkness. What they found in that hidden cellar was both salvation and heartbreak. Shelves lined the stone walls, filled with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Enough food to feed them through the winter, maybe longer. But scattered among the provisions were other things, small clothes, folded and clean. Children's shoes, lined up in careful pairs. A row of simple wooden crosses, each bearing a name and date carved in the same careful hand. Peter Morrison, age 6, died January 12, 1852. Lucy Chun, age 4, died January 18, 1852. Samuel Wright, age 9, died February 2nd, 1852. 12 crosses, 12 names. The children who had died here the winter before, remembered by someone who had cared enough to carve their names in wood and keep their clothes clean and their memories sacred. At the far end of the cellar, they found him. Brother Francis sat in a wooden chair, his hands folded in his lap, his head tilted back against the stone wall. He had been dead for months, his body preserved by the cold and dry air of the cellar. On the small table beside him was a letter, written in the same careful script as the crosses. To whoever finds us, the letter began. My name is Brother Francis Kellerman. I stayed with the children when the others left. I could not leave them alone. I could not let them die without someone to pray over them, to remember their names, to love them as Christ loved the least of these. The food will last until spring. The Lord will provide. Tell the world what happened here. Tell them we were not forgotten. Sister Margaret read the letter twice, her hands shaking in the candlelight. Here was the answer to the mystery of Bellmoor House. Here was why the children had died, not from cruelty, but from love. Brother Francis had stayed when the paid caretakers fled. He had tended the sick, buried the dead, and sat with the dying until there was no one left to tend but himself. The children clustered around her, their faces solemn in the flickering light. They understood, in the way that children who have known loss always understand, that they were standing in a place where love had been stronger than fear, where someone had chosen to die rather than abandon those who needed him. Thomas touched one of the small crosses with gentle fingers. "Will you stay with us like you did, sister?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Sister Margaret looked at their faces, 13 souls that had been thrown away by the world, 13 lights that still burned despite everything that had tried to put them out. She thought of Brother Francis, choosing love over safety, choosing presence over survival. Above them, the winter wind began to howl against the walls of Bellmoor House, and she knew that the hardest tests of faith were not the ones that asked you to believe in miracles, but the ones that asked you to become one. April 20th, 1853. The morning came soft and warm, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers through the cracks in the boarded windows. Sister Margaret opened her eyes to sunlight, real sunlight, streaming through a gap in the boards like a message from heaven itself. For the first time in 6 months, she could not see her breath in the air. Beside her, Thomas stirred in his sleep, his wooden horse still clutched against his chest. At 8 years old now, he had grown tall, but remained thin, his face marked by the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving what should not be survived. Mary lay curled against his shoulder, her dark eyes already open and watching the dust motes dance in the golden light. She was 5 now, and still had not spoken, but her silence had become a different thing over the winter. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who had learned that some truths were too deep for words. Sarah was gone. Sweet Sarah, who had sung lullabies and shared her bread and tried so hard to be a mother to them all. The fever had taken her in February, along with James and 6 others whose names Sister Margaret whispered in her prayers every morning. They lay now in the small cemetery behind the house, next to Brother Francis and the 12 who had died the winter before. Henry had carved their crosses with shaking hands, each letter a prayer, each name a promise that they would not be forgotten. Henry was gone too. The old coachman had died in his sleep, just as the worst of the winter was breaking, his heart finally worn out by cold and sorrow and the weight of trying to save children who were already too close to angels. Sister Margaret had found him in the morning, peaceful at last, his weathered hands folded over a letter he had been writing to his daughter in Pittsburgh. A letter that would never be sent to a woman who would never know how her father had died a saint. But 4 had lived. For out of 13, plus herself, they had made it through the longest winter in Pennsylvania's recorded history, through months when the snow piled against the windows and the wind howled like all the ghosts in the world were trying to get inside. They had made it through sickness and hunger and nights so cold that they had slept pressed together like puppies, sharing breath and warmth and the stubborn refusal to give up. Sister Margaret rose carefully her bones aching in ways that made her feel older than her 24 years. She moved to the window and peered through the gap in the boards. The world outside was green and alive, washed clean by spring rains and warming in the gentle sun. Birds were singing in the trees that had stood bare and black all winter. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear running water where the frozen streams had finally thawed. The children woke slowly, blinking in the unfamiliar warmth. Thomas sat up first, as he always did, checking on Mary and then on John, the youngest survivor at barely 6 years old. John had been sick for most of the winter, burning with fevers that should have killed him, but somehow he had fought his way back to life again and again. He was still small and frail, but there was color in his cheeks now, and his eyes were bright and curious. "Sister," Thomas said, his voice still rough from sleep. "Is it over? The winter?" She smiled at him, the first real smile she had felt in months. "Yes, Thomas. The winter is over." They ate breakfast from the last of Brother Francis's preserve stores, and Sister Margaret began to make plans. They would need to leave Bellmoor House soon. The food was almost gone, and she knew that people would come eventually, officials and investigators who would ask questions and write reports and try to make sense of what had happened here. The children had been through enough. They did not need to relive their story for strangers. But first, there were things that needed to be done. Letters to write, graves to tend, promises to keep. That afternoon, while the children played in the sunshine outside, she sat at the kitchen table with paper and ink that Henry had saved from his traveling supplies. She wrote carefully, her hand steady despite everything, telling the story that needed to be told. To the Diocese of Pittsburgh, she began. "I write to inform you that of the 13 children sent to Bellmoor House in October of 1852, for have survived the winter. Their names are Thomas Chun, age 8, Mary Sullivan, age 5, John Morrison, age 6, and myself, Sister Margaret Kellerman. Yes, Kellerman. Brother Francis was my uncle, and I knew what I would find when I came here. I came anyway, because someone needed to stay with the children. Someone needed to love them when everyone else had given up." She wrote about the hidden cellar and the preserved food, about Brother Francis and his choice to die among those he served rather than abandon them, about Henry Walsh, who had stayed when he could have left, who had chosen compassion over safety, about the children who had died and the children who had lived, and the thin line between tragedy and miracle that had carried them through the darkest winter of their lives. "I do not ask for your forgiveness," she wrote in closing. "I ask only that you remember their names. All of them. The ones who died and the ones who lived. They were not burdens to be discarded. They were children. They were precious. They were loved." 3 days later, as she sealed the letter and prepared to leave Bellmoor House forever, Thomas found her in the chapel where she was saying her final prayers. "Sister," he said quietly, "will you tell me their names again? All of them who were here with us." She took his hand and felt the strength in his small fingers, the life that had refused to be extinguished despite everything the world had thrown at him. "Sarah McKenna," she began, and he nodded, remembering. "Jamie Zobrai, Lucy Parks, Samuel Wright." One by one, she spoke the names of all who had lived and died in Bellmoor House over those 2 terrible winters. 21 children in total, and 2 adults who had chosen to die rather than abandon them. Thomas listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that remembering was a sacred duty, that names spoken with love become eternal things. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What happens to their stories now, sister? When we leave, who will remember?" Sister Margaret looked around the empty chapel, at the walls that had heard so many prayers and held so many tears. She thought about the letters she had hidden in the cellar, the records she had kept, the small crosses that marked each grave in the woods behind the house. "The walls will remember," she said finally. "And someday, when people are ready to hear it, the story will find its way into the light. Stories like this always do. They're too important to stay buried forever." Years later, in 1891, when developers came to tear down the abandoned Bellmoor House, they found more than they expected. Hidden in the walls were letters and photographs, and carefully kept records of everything that had happened during those 2 winters. They found evidence not just of tragedy, but of love that had been stronger than death, of choices that had turned ordinary people into saints. The story spread slowly at first, whispered among the workers who had found the hidden treasures. But stories like this have their own life, their own power to touch hearts and change minds. Eventually, it reached the newspapers, then the churches, then the schools where children learned about courage and sacrifice and the way love can light a candle in even the darkest places. Sister Margaret lived to be 93 years old, spending her life caring for orphan children in a small convent outside Pittsburgh. Thomas became a carpenter like his father, building homes for families who needed them. Mary eventually found her voice and became a teacher, though she never spoke of those winter months except to say that she had learned what it meant to be truly loved. John grew up to be a minister, preaching about grace and second chances and the way God sometimes sends angels disguised as ordinary people. And in the hills of western Pennsylvania, where Bellmoor House once stood, locals say that on quiet spring mornings you can sometimes hear the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, bright and joyful and free, as if somewhere in the space between memory and hope, love had found a way to make all the broken things whole again.